Hello guys, welcome to the 7th part of Angular-10 series of tutorials. This is the continuation of part 6. In this tutorial, we'll see what is property binding and how can we use it. So let's get started. Property binding is also a one-way data binding technique which flows the data from component to HTML template. In property binding, we can bind a property of a DOM element to a field which is defined a property in our component. The properties bound to an element are always present using square brackets. But before proceeding with examples of property binding, the things we need to remember is in property binding we can bind to a property of a DOM, not to an HTML attribute. Let's understand this in a better way. We are back to Visual Studio Code. Let me get rid of this code and add one HTML input element. If you notice, the HTML input element has attributes called ID, type, and value. Once the browser parses this HTML, a corresponding DOM node will be created. As that node is an object, it contains the properties like ID, type, and value. The ID property is a reflected property for ID attribute. Same with type property and value property as well. With this understanding, let's launch the browser development tools and try to access the element attribute value and the DOM property value of this input field. Okay, let's launch the developer tools. To do that, we need to right click on the input element and click on inspect. And let's go to the console and type $0, which takes the control of this HTML input element. So let's get the value associated to the attributes of this input field. To do that, we need to add $0.getAttribute, which takes one argument as attribute name. So let's give the attribute name as value inside a single quotes. So we are able to get the associated value of this attribute as Govardhan. Similarly, let's get the value associated to a DOM property. For that, we need to type $0.value. Perfect. It returned the current value that associated to the DOM property. Let's update the input field. We have updated the input field and let's try to get the attribute and DOM property values again. Let me recall the values again. And perfect. If you notice, attribute value hasn't changed. Only the DOM property value got updated. It means the attributes and properties are not same. Attributes are used to initialize the DOM properties at the creation of DOM. And attribute values can't change once their respective fields changed. Hence, the property binding works on DOM properties, not with HTML attributes. With this information, let's dive to the Visual Studio Code and create few examples of property binding. Okay, instead of hard coding the value for this input field, let's bind the title property using property binding. As discussed, property binding uses square brackets. Let us put this value property inside the square brackets and assign title to it. Let me put square brackets and let me get rid of this hard-coded string and add a title in single quotes. Let me save this. Okay, let us launch the browser and verify. Perfect. We are able to render the text associated to title property using property binding. Let's see one more example for property binding. For that, let me create a Boolean property by convention is disabled. And I want to assign this is disabled property to the disabled property of a button so that I can enable and disable a button based on the value of this property. Okay, let us create a button and assign is disabled property to the disabled property of a button. Let me save this and launch the browser. Now the submit button is in enabled state because we assign the value false to that is disabled property. Let's change the is disabled property to true and see whether the button will get disabled or not. Make it to true and save this. We launch the browser. Perfect. The button is getting disabled now. Perfect. We had seen a couple of examples of property binding. In the first one, we had assigned the title property to the value using property binding. But the question is, can't we do that using string interpolation? Let's try that. Let us add one more input tag and bind the title property to it using string interpolation. Let us save this and launch the browser. Perfect. We are able to render the text by using both property binding and string interpolation. Also, if you notice, in both string interpolation and property binding, the data flows from TypeScript code to HTML template. The ultimate question now is when to use string interpolation and when to use property binding. Let's discuss about that in our next tutorial. Thanks for watching.